The night was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional clink of glasses and the low hum of conversation. The underground bar, hidden away in the depths of a small town, was a sanctuary for those who wanted to be left alone. Dim lights cast long shadows on wooden walls, the scent of whiskey and smoke lingering in the air. It was the kind of place where trouble was neither welcomed nor expected, but trouble came anyway. The heavy door burst open, slamming against the wall. A group of men stormed in, their presence like a storm rolling through a quiet valley. 6 of them, clad in leather and arrogance, radiating the kind of confidence that only fear could buy. At their center was Damian Vega, a name whispered in dark corners, a man who thrived on control. He didn't come for a drink. He came to make a statement. The patrons shrank in their seats, avoiding eye contact, their gazes fixed on their half-empty glasses. No one dared to challenge the gang. No one except for a single woman who remained utterly still at the far end of the room. She wore a leather jacket and a green beret, her expression unreadable as she sipped her drink. Unlike the others, she did not shrink. She did not flinch. She simply observed. Her name was Valeria Cruz, a former Special Forces soldier trained in the art of survival and combat. She wasn't looking for trouble, but when the gang's attention turned to a young waitress, she knew she couldn't ignore it. Damian's smirk widened as he approached her. "You got a problem, sweetheart?" Valeria set her glass down, her eyes locking onto his. "Not yet." Tonight, the gang was about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. The underground bar had the kind of atmosphere that swallowed secrets. Dimly lit, lined with aging wooden beams and soaked in the scent of whiskey and smoke, it was a refuge for those who preferred the world to forget them. Conversations murmured just above the hum of an old jukebox, low and cautious, as if the very walls could betray a careless word. Valeria Cruz sat at the far end, her back to the wall, fingers wrapped loosely around a glass of bourbon. She didn't drink for pleasure, never had. It was just a habit, a means to blend in. Her eyes moved without moving, cataloging every detail. The nervous bartender rubbing a cloth over the same spot on the counter. The cautious glances exchanged between locals. The way a young waitress, no older than 20, moved swiftly from table to table, head lowered, forcing a smile. Something felt wrong. Then the door slammed open. A gust of cold air rushed in as 6 men stepped inside, their presence thick and overbearing. They moved like they owned the place, because, in a way, they did. Damian Vega led the pack, his every step carrying a silent threat. He wasn't particularly big, but there was something about him, the confidence of a man who had never been told no and lived without consequence. His leather jacket stretched over a wiry frame, and his sharp eyes flicked over the room, searching for entertainment. The bar fell silent. Damian smirked, his voice cutting through the heavy quiet. "What's this? A funeral?" No one answered. No one dared. One of his men chuckled, dragging a chair from an occupied table. The 2 men sitting there exchanged nervous glances before rising and slipping away. Another thug reached over the bar, grabbing a bottle straight from the shelf, while the bartender stood frozen, too afraid to object. Then, Valeria saw it. The real reason the air had grown so tight. The waitress. She had just set down a drink when one of the thugs, a broad-shouldered brute with a shaved head, grabbed her wrist. She flinched, her forced smile fading. "Hey now," the man sneered. "Where's our welcome?" The girl swallowed hard. I just served you. Do you need something else?" His grip tightened. "Yeah." A little enthusiasm. The room was deathly quiet. Every patron stared into their drinks, pretending not to see, not to hear, except one. Valeria set her glass down with a quiet clink. Damian, leaning against the bar, caught the movement. His smirk widened. "Now, this is interesting," he murmured. Valeria stood. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't meant to be, but in a room full of people who made themselves small, the simple act of rising was enough to shift the air. She moved with unhurried ease, boots clicking softly against the floorboards as she approached. No tension in her shoulders, no aggression in her stance, just a quiet, measured presence. She stopped beside the thug holding the waitress's wrist, looked at him as if he were a mild inconvenience. "Let go," she said. The man blinked, then let out a short laugh. "What?" Valeria didn't repeat herself. Damian turned fully now, his grin widening. "Oh, sweetheart, are you sure you want to do this?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't like repeating myself," she said. A murmur rippled through the bar. No one had ever spoken to Damian Vega like that. For the first time, his smirk faltered, just slightly. Then it returned. "Well, well," he mused, cracking his knuckles. "Looks like we've got ourselves a tough one." He stepped forward, his men watching closely. Valeria didn't move. She had seen men like him before, men who mistook fear for respect. Who thought control was something you took rather than something you earned. Damian chuckled. "All right then, let's see just how tough you really are." The storm had arrived. A tense silence stretched across the bar. No one moved, no one spoke. The air was thick with unspoken warnings, the kind of quiet that came before a storm. Valeria Cruz stood calm, unwavering, facing down Damian Vega and his men. The waitress beside her was frozen, her wrist still trapped in the thug's grip, eyes wide with fear. Damian tilted his head, amusement flickering in his sharp gaze. "I'll give you one last chance to mind your own business, sweetheart." Valeria's expression remained unreadable. "Let her go." The thug gripping the waitress let out a short laugh. Or what? Valeria moved. It happened so fast, most people in the bar didn't even see it. 1 second, the thug was smirking, and the next, his wrist was bent back at an unnatural angle. He barely had time to cry out before Valeria twisted sharply. Crack, forcing him to release the girl with a strangled yelp. He stumbled backward, clutching his wrist, his face contorted in pain. The entire room inhaled as one. Damian's smirk widened, but his eyes darkened. The tension in the room sharpened to a knife's edge. The waitress, free from the thug's grip, stepped back in shock. Valeria glanced at her. "Go." She hesitated for only a second before scurrying toward the back of the bar, disappearing behind the counter. Damian chuckled, slow and deep, as he stepped closer. That was a mistake. Valeria met his gaze, steady and unaffected. "The only mistake here is thinking I'll back down." A muscle in Damian's jaw twitched. He wasn't used to defiance. His men, once laughing and relaxed, now shifted uneasily. They had expected an easy night, intimidate a few people, get a few free drinks, remind everyone who ran this town. They hadn't expected her. One of Damian's thugs, a wiry man with a scar down his cheek, clenched his fists. "You think you're tough, lady?" Valeria glanced at him, unconcerned. "I don't think." "I know." Damian exhaled sharply through his nose, his amusement fading. "You've got some nerve. Maybe I should teach you some respect." He cracked his knuckles, taking another step forward. Valeria didn't move. The bar's patrons sat frozen, caught between curiosity and fear. They had seen this gang break men in half for less, but there was something different about the woman in the leather jacket. Something unshakable. "You really want to do this in front of everyone?" Valeria asked, voice steady. Damian's grin returned, but this time it was colder. "I want to do this because of everyone." With a slow, deliberate movement, he rolled up his sleeves, exposing tattooed forearms lined with scars. "You're standing in my bar in my town, thinking you can act tough. I don't know who the hell you think you are, but I'm about to remind you of your place." Valeria exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "This isn't your town," she said simply. "You just think it is because no one's stopped you yet." Damian's expression flickered with something, irritation, curiosity, maybe even the smallest hint of doubt. Then, as if deciding he was done talking, he lunged. His hand shot out, aiming to grab her by the collar, to yank her forward, to intimidate her the way he had so many before. He never got the chance. Valeria moved like lightning. Before he could touch her, she pivoted smoothly, grabbing his wrist in a vice grip. A split second later, she twisted, using his own momentum against him. Damian staggered as Valeria wrenched his arm downward, forcing him off balance. A sharp twist, a well-placed sweep of her boot, and bam! He was sent crashing to the ground, his back slamming against the wooden floor with a thunderous impact. The bar went completely silent. Damian gasped, pain shooting through his spine as he stared up at the ceiling in disbelief. His men froze. They had never seen him on the ground before. Valeria stepped back, casual, calm, as if nothing had happened. Damian's breathing was ragged as he slowly sat up, his face twisted in fury. Valeria looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "You done?" she asked. The room held its breath. Damian's hands curled into fists. No, he wasn't done. Not even close. The bar was deathly silent. The only sound was the ragged breathing of Damian Vega as he sat on the floor, stunned. His ego bruised more than his body. His own men stood frozen, unsure whether to step in or step back. No one had ever humiliated him like this. Valeria Cruz stood before him, calm as ever, her posture relaxed but ready. She had faced worse threats before. Men like Damian thought they owned the world, but she knew better. Power didn't come from fear. It came from control. And right now, she had all of it. Damian's lip curled in rage as he slowly pushed himself up, his joints popping from the impact of the fall. His pride was screaming. He needed to take back control to re-establish his dominance in front of his men. He took a step forward, then another. Without warning, he swung. His fist sliced through the air, aimed straight at Valeria's face. She didn't flinch. At the last possible second, she moved. A simple shift of weight, a slight tilt of her head, and the punch missed by a breath. Before Damian could react, she struck. A precise jab, sharp controlled, landed against his ribs. He barely had time to register the pain before her knee shot up, slamming into his gut. He coughed, stumbling backward. The bar erupted into chaos. His men surged forward, their instincts kicking in. They couldn't just stand by and watch their leader be dismantled. Valeria exhaled. Here we go. The first thug charged, a broad-shouldered brute, reckless and angry. He threw a wild punch, but Valeria sidestepped it effortlessly. Using his own momentum, she grabbed his arm, twisted sharply, and sent him flipping onto his back with a heavy thud. Another lunged from the side. She ducked just in time, his fist sailing harmlessly overhead. Before he could recover, she drove an elbow into his jaw. He crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut. Two more came at her simultaneously. Valeria pivoted, dodging the first attacker while catching the second's wrist mid-swing. She twisted, snap, and he howled in pain as she dislocated his shoulder. The other man hesitated. Big mistake. In an instant, she grabbed a bottle from the bar and smashed it against the edge of the counter, shattering the glass. She didn't intend to use it, but the threat was enough. The man flinched, taking an instinctive step back. Valeria smiled faintly. Smart choice. Damian, still clutching his stomach, watched in shock as his men struggled against this one woman. Fear flickered in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with rage. "You think this is over?" he snarled. Valeria turned to him, her expression still unreadable. "I think you should walk away." Damian's fists trembled with frustration. He couldn't let it end like this. His men were hesitating, some already stepping back. If he lost control here, he lost everything. With a roar, he grabbed a chair and swung it at her. Valeria didn't hesitate. She ducked, and as the chair crashed into the bar behind her, she struck again. A solid punch to the solar plexus. Damian's breath hitched as pain exploded in his chest. His knees buckled. Then, for the final blow, she hooked a foot behind his leg and swept it out from under him. He crashed into the counter, knocking over bottles and glasses. This time he didn't get up so fast. The remaining gang members stood still, their confidence shattered. They exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for a command that never came. Damian groaned, his body slumped against the bar. He lifted his head, glaring up at Valeria with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. Valeria tilted her head slightly. "I know." The tension in the room was suffocating. No one moved. No one dared breathe too loudly. Damian's men, seeing their leader beaten, hesitated. One by one, they backed toward the door. Their bravado was gone, replaced by caution. Valeria didn't chase them. She didn't need to. They had already lost. Damian staggered to his feet, wiping blood from his lip. His glare burned into her, but there was something else there now, hesitation. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was the one in control. "You'll regret this," he growled before turning and shoving past his men. The gang left as quickly as they had arrived, slamming the door behind them. Silence followed. Then, slowly, life returned to the bar. The bartender exhaled, shoulders sagging in relief. A few patrons exchanged glances, muttering under their breath. The young waitress peeked out from behind the counter, her wide eyes locked onto Valeria. Valeria picked up her glass from the table, took a sip, and set it back down. The storm had passed. For now. The bar remained frozen in the aftermath of the fight. The smell of spilled whiskey and shattered glass lingered in the air. Patrons whispered among themselves, exchanging glances of disbelief and awe. Valeria Cruz picked up her glass and took a slow sip, as if nothing had happened. The young waitress, still shaken, approached hesitantly. Thank you," she stammered. Valeria simply nodded. "You're safe now." The bartender, an older man with tired eyes, exhaled and reached beneath the counter. He pulled out a fresh bottle of bourbon, pouring a generous glass for Valeria. "On the house," he said. his voice gruff with gratitude. She didn't argue. She took the drink, her eyes still locked on the door where Damian Vega and his men had fled. This wasn't over. She had seen it in his eyes, the burning fury of a man whose ego had been shattered. Men like Damian didn't take humiliation lightly. They retaliated, they regrouped, struck back harder, and he would come for her. Outside, the cold night air did little to cool Damian's rage. He stormed down the street, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. His men followed, silent, their arrogance stripped away. One of them, the wiry thug with the scar on his cheek, finally spoke. "Boss, what do we do?" Damian stopped abruptly, spinning on his heel. "We're not letting her get away with that," he hissed. His hand still throbbed from where she had twisted it. His ribs sore from the blow she had delivered. He had underestimated her, something he would never do again. "She made us look like fools," another thug muttered. Damian's nostrils flared. "We hit back. Hard. Tonight." The men exchanged uncertain glances. They had just witnessed what she was capable of. Even outnumbered, she had taken them apart with precision. "She's dangerous," Scarface muttered. Damian grabbed him by the collar, yanking him forward. "And what? We're not?" His breath was hot, filled with anger and wounded pride. "You scared of one woman?" Scarface swallowed. "No, boss, but—" Damian shoved him back. "Then shut up and listen." He paced, his mind racing. "We find her. We don't rush in like idiots this time, we do it right." A cruel smile stretched across his face. "She's strong, fine, but she's just one person. And no matter how good she is, she's still human. She has limits." He turned to his men, his voice dark and low. "We push her past those limits." The others nodded, their hesitation melting into cold determination. "Spread out. Ask around. Someone here knows who she is, where she's staying. I want answers." The gang scattered into the night, their mission clear. Damian stood still for a moment, staring down at his bruised hands. His mind played the scene over and over, the way she had moved, the way she had dropped him in front of everyone. He let out a slow breath. She was good, but no one was untouchable. Inside the bar, Valeria finished her drink and rose from her seat. She could feel the eyes on her, silent admiration, quiet curiosity, but also fear. She had sent a message tonight, but she knew it wasn't the end. She left a few bills on the counter, nodded at the bartender and headed for the door. The night was crisp, the air thick with the scent of rain. The streets were quiet, but she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Damian wouldn't let this go. He would come, and when he did, he wouldn't be alone. She needed to be ready. As she walked down the dimly lit road, her mind was already calculating. Terrain, exits, numbers, tactical advantages. She had no interest in a prolonged battle, but if they came for her, she would end it before it escalated further. She turned a corner, her boots echoing softly against the pavement. Then a shadow moved. She stopped. The faintest shuffle of feet, the subtle shift of weight. Someone was watching. Her hand instinctively went to her side, fingers brushing against the cold steel of her concealed knife. She wasn't alone. A slow smirk pulled at the corner of her lips. So, it begins. The night was still, but Valeria Cruz knew better. She wasn't alone. Her senses sharpened, her body instinctively slipping into a combat-ready state. Years of training had conditioned her to detect even the subtlest shifts in her environment, the way the wind carried a sound, the faint echo of a misplaced footstep. She didn't turn immediately. Instead, she kept walking, her pace unchanged, her breath steady. Then, without warning, she pivoted. A flick of her wrist sent her knife flying through the darkness. Thunk. It embedded itself into a wooden post, just inches from where a man had been standing. A sharp inhale, a hesitant step backward. "Step out," Valeria ordered, her voice calm but firm. Slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. A young man, no more than 20. Skinny, jittery, with wide, nervous eyes. His clothes were ragged, his fingers twitching at his sides. He wasn't a fighter. "You've been following me," she said, retrieving her knife in a single swift motion. He swallowed hard. I wasn't gonna hurt you." She raised an eyebrow. "I swear," he insisted. "Damian sent guys out looking for you. I heard them asking around, so I thought, maybe if I found you first." Valeria tilted her head. "You'd do what? Sell me out?" His hands shot up defensively. No, I wanted to warn you." She studied him for a moment, gauging his sincerity. He was terrified, but not of her, of Damian. She exhaled, lowering her knife slightly. "Start talking." As the young man, Luis, told her what he knew, Valeria's mind drifted back to a different time, a different place. Years ago. A training ground in the middle of nowhere, the air thick with dust and sweat. The sound of fists meeting flesh, of grunts, of bodies hitting the dirt. Valeria stood among them, younger but already hardened. "Again!" the instructor barked. She clenched her fists and stepped forward. A man, twice her size, lunged. She sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, twisted. He went down with a thud, gasping as his arm was wrenched at an unnatural angle. A whistle blew. The instructor crouched beside the fallen man, nodded in approval, then turned to her. "You hesitated less that time." She only nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. It had been like this for years. Brutal, relentless. Survival training, combat simulations, close quarters combat, no mercy, no hesitation, no second chances. "Cruz," the instructor called. She snapped to attention. He stared at her, eyes calculating. "What's the most important lesson?" She met his gaze. To always be in control. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Good. Now again." And so she fought. Every hit, every counter, every technique refined to perfection. There was no room for weakness, not then, not now. Luis shifted nervously as Valeria refocused on the present. "They're planning something," he whispered. "Damian, he's furious. He won't stop until you're dead." Valeria sheathed her knife. "I figured." Luis hesitated. "You should leave town." She chuckled softly. "Not an option." He shook his head. "You don't get it. He's calling in help." Valeria's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in her chest. "What kind of help?" Luis licked his lips. "A mercenary. Someone bad. Someone worse than Damian." She exhaled. A name surfaced in her mind before he even said it. "Elias Montenegro." Luis nodded. "You know him?" Oh, she knew him. Elias Montenegro wasn't just some thug for hire. He was ex-military, trained in black ops, a ghost who left bodies in his wake. If Damian had reached out to him, this was bigger than a simple grudge. This was war. Valeria sighed. Of course, it wouldn't be easy. Luis fidgeted. "You really think you can beat them?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't think. I know." Luis stared, as if seeing her for the first time. He had heard stories, whispers about a woman who fought like a demon, who never lost. But seeing her now, standing in the dim glow of the street lamp, her stance firm, her eyes cold and calculating, he finally understood. She wasn't just a fighter. She was something else entirely, something unstoppable. And Damian Vega was about to learn that the hard way. The streets were eerily quiet. Valeria Cruz moved with practiced ease, her senses heightened. She knew what was coming. Damian wouldn't let her humiliation go unanswered, and now that she knew he had called in Elias Montenegro, the stakes had risen. Luis had been right. She could leave town, but that wasn't an option. Because running wasn't in her nature. Because leaving meant the people in that bar, that waitress, the bartender, the frightened patrons, would still be trapped under Damian's rule. And Valeria had never been one to walk away from a fight. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. They were coming. From a rooftop across the street, a figure crouched in the shadows. "She's heading down Calle Roja," a voice murmured into a radio. Damian's voice crackled back. "Good. Stick to the plan. We corner her in the alley. No mistakes." The scout smirked. She won't know what hit her. Valeria knew. She could feel the shift in the air, the way the shadows seemed to move unnaturally, the way the silence felt wrong. She walked past an abandoned store, her reflection flickering in the shattered window. Then, there, a figure moved at the edge of her vision, another behind her. She kept walking. She counted them without looking. 3 in front, 2 behind, at least one watching from higher ground. They wanted to herd her. A trap. She almost smiled. Amateurs. At the last second, she turned sharply, stepping into a side alley, exactly where they wanted her to go. Damian's men followed, their footsteps quick and eager. They thought she was panicking, that she had made a mistake. They thought she was cornered. Damian himself emerged from the darkness, slow and deliberate. His lip was still bruised from their last encounter, his pride even more so. He stood in the middle of the alley, blocking the only exit, with his men forming a semicircle around Valeria. "Funny," he said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. You didn't seem like the type to make stupid choices. Valeria tilted her head slightly. And yet, here we are. Damian's smirk twitched, his fingers clenching into fists. Behind her, the other men moved closer. Valeria exhaled. So, what's the plan, Vega? A fair fight? She gestured toward his men. Or are you too afraid to face me alone again? Damian chuckled. Oh, sweetheart, I learned my lesson. You're dangerous. His expression darkened. But even you can't take all of us. Valeria rolled her shoulders. We'll see. They attacked at once. The first thug lunged from the left, a switchblade flashing in his grip. Valeria moved faster. Her foot shot up, straight into his wrist. A sickening crack echoed in the alley as the knife went flying. Before he could react, she spun, elbowing him in the jaw. He collapsed instantly. Another came from the right, swinging a metal pipe. She ducked. The pipe whooshed past her, smashing against the brick wall. In the same motion, she grabbed his wrist, twisted sharply, and slam, flipped him over her shoulder. His head hit the ground. He didn't get up. A third man grabbed her from behind. Wrong move. Valeria drove her elbow into his ribs, then pulled forward, flipping him over her back. He landed with a grunt, his breath knocked out. It was over in seconds. Damian took a slow step forward, his eyes narrowing. You think this is over? Valeria exhaled. No, I think you're stalling. Damian grinned. That's right. Something shifted in the shadows. A new presence. Valeria's muscles tensed. She had known they were coming for her, but this was different. Then she heard it. The slow, measured clap. The kind that wasn't meant to applaud, but to taunt. From the darkness, a figure stepped forward. Broad-shouldered, calm, dangerous. Elias Montenegro. His gaze was unreadable, his movements calculated. A soldier turned mercenary. Valeria exhaled. So, the real fight was about to begin. Elias Montenegro stood at the mouth of the alley, the dim light casting sharp shadows over his chiseled face. He was taller than Damian, broader, built like someone who had spent years sculpting his body into a weapon. But it wasn't his size that made him dangerous. It was the way he carried himself, calm, collected, calculated. Unlike Damian and his gang of arrogant thugs, Elias didn't underestimate anyone, especially not Valeria Cruz. He took a slow step forward, boots echoing against the cracked pavement. I've heard about you, he said, voice deep and smooth, like the calm before a storm. The woman who took down an entire gang in a bar fight. Valeria's stance remained relaxed, but she was already analyzing him. His posture, his breathing, the way he shifted his weight, everything spoke of precision and experience. This wasn't a street brawler. This was a professional. She let out a slow breath. And I've heard about you. Elias smirked. Then you know how this ends. Damian, still nursing his bruised ego, stepped to the side, grinning. You're screwed now, sweetheart. Valeria didn't even look at him. Her focus was locked on Elias. I wouldn't be so sure. Then, without warning, he moved. Fast. Faster than anyone she had fought tonight. Valeria barely had time to react as Elias struck with surgical precision. His fist lashed out, aiming for her ribs. She twisted, just narrowly avoiding the blow, but before she could counter, he was already adjusting, throwing a knee toward her midsection. She blocked, the impact reverberating up her arm. Strong. No wasted movement. No reckless aggression. Every strike was calculated. Valeria didn't have time to think, only to react. She threw a sharp jab toward his jaw, but he leaned back effortlessly, dodging it by mere inches. He retaliated immediately, a sharp hook aimed at her temple. She ducked, swept a leg toward his ankles. He jumped back. They reset. The alley felt smaller now, closing in around them as they circled each other, neither making the first mistake. The gang watched in stunned silence. This wasn't a bar fight. This was something else entirely. Elias smirked. You're good. Valeria rolled her shoulders. So are you. Then he attacked again. Faster. Harder. A rapid flurry of blows, each one expertly placed, each one testing her defenses. Valeria blocked two, dodged another, but the fourth, a brutal knee strike to the ribs, connected. Pain exploded through her side. She gritted her teeth, ignoring it, countering instantly. She grabbed his arm, twisted sharply, but he broke free before she could lock it in. They separated again, breathing heavy. This wasn't like fighting Damian or his thugs. Elias was different, a real opponent. He studied her, tilting his head slightly. Most people don't last this long against me. Valeria wiped the corner of her mouth with her thumb, tasting blood. "I'm not most people." Damian let out a frustrated growl. "What the hell are you waiting for, Montenegro? Finish her." Elias ignored him. His focus never wavered. Valeria saw it then. This wasn't personal for him. Damian wanted revenge. Elias? He wanted a challenge. She exhaled. Then she smiled. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Something funny?" She rolled her shoulders. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" A flicker of amusement crossed his face. A little. Then they lunged at each other again. The fight turned brutal. Valeria knew she couldn't overpower him. He was bigger, stronger, but she was faster, smarter. She changed tactics. Instead of meeting him head-on, she began redirecting his force. Every time he struck, she turned the momentum against him. A sidestep here, a deflection there. She wasn't trying to overpower him. She was wearing him down, and it was working. Elias exhaled sharply as he missed a strike. The first mistake. Valeria seized the opening. A sharp elbow to his ribs, his first real hit taken tonight. He grunted, but recovered quickly. "Not bad," she smirked. "I'm just getting started." Damian, growing impatient, suddenly drew a gun. The metallic click echoed through the alley. "Enough of this bullshit." Valeria barely had time to react before Elias did. Faster than anyone expected, Elias turned and grabbed Damian's wrist. With a sharp twist, he disarmed him in a blink, sending the gun clattering to the ground. Damian gasped. "What?" Elias didn't look amused anymore. "You interrupted my fight," he said coldly. Damian took a step back, suddenly unsure. Elias turned back to Valeria. A beat passed. Then he smiled. "You're good," he said again, rolling his shoulders. "This just got interesting." Valeria smirked. "Glad you're having fun." Elias took a slow breath. "Next round, we go all in." She nodded. "Fine by me." The alley smelled of sweat and blood. The fight had shifted from survival to something else entirely. A test, a challenge. Elias Montenegro rolled his shoulders, exhaling sharply. The thrill of a real fight shone in his eyes. He wasn't like Damian. He wasn't fueled by ego or revenge. He was a warrior, just like Valeria. And warriors didn't fight out of anger. They fought for the sake of the fight itself. Valeria wiped the blood from her lip and smiled. "Round two?" Elias chuckled, adjusting his stance. "Let's make it interesting." Damian, still recovering from being disarmed, scowled. "This isn't a game, Montenegro. Kill her." Elias didn't even glance at him. Valeria took a breath, resetting her focus. She knew what came next. The first round had been about reading each other, testing reflexes, patience, endurance. This round, this was about winning. The shift in battle. Elias struck first. A low kick, designed to sweep her legs. Valeria dodged, countering with a jab. He blocked. A moment of stillness. Then they attacked at the same time. Their strikes were faster, sharper, less caution, more risk. Elias aimed for her ribs. She dodged. Valeria spun, aiming for his jaw. He leaned back. Their movements were almost synchronized, two fighters at their peak, mirroring each other in skill. Damian and his men watched in stunned silence. They had expected a slaughter. Instead, they were witnessing something else. Elias smirked mid-fight. "You're faster than I thought." Valeria ducked under a hook. "And you're stronger than I expected." She was adapting. Elias fought with power and precision, using his size to dominate the space. But Valeria was a tactician. She didn't fight him. She redirected him. She frustrated him. And slowly she turned the fight in her favor. Damian's desperation. Damian Vega was losing control. This was supposed to be his revenge, his moment to put Valeria in the dirt. But instead, Montenegro was playing games. Damian's eyes darted to the gun on the ground. No more waiting, he lunged for it. Valeria saw. She moved on instinct. A kick to Damian's wrist. The gun slid away. Elias turned, expression darkening. "Really?" Damian, furious, spit blood onto the ground. "I'm done playing." Elias exhaled, annoyed. "Then leave." Damian's face twisted. "What?" Elias didn't blink. "This fight isn't yours anymore." Damian exploded with rage. "You work for me, Montenegro." Elias finally turned to him. "No," he said simply. Then, without warning, he punched Damian. The hit was clean, fast, final. Damian dropped. The gang froze. Elias cracked his knuckles, looking down at the unconscious man. That was overdue. Valeria raised an eyebrow. Was that part of the fight? Elias grinned. Call it a bonus round. Damian's men hesitated. Without their leader, they were lost. Valeria took a step forward. They stepped back. Elias looked at them, then back at Valeria. So, what now? She didn't hesitate. I finish this. Elias tilted his head. And if I don't stop you? Valeria met his gaze. Then we don't have to fight. A beat of silence. Then, Elias smiled. Interesting. The decision. Elias wasn't an idiot. He had taken jobs for money. He had fought wars for survival. But tonight, he had fought for respect. And he respected her. He exhaled, glancing once more at Damian's unconscious body. He's not worth it. Then, in a move that stunned everyone, he turned and walked away. The gang watched, unsure. Unless you want to end up like him, Valeria said, nodding at Damian, I suggest you do the same. One by one, they ran. And just like that, it was over. The alley was eerily silent. A slow breeze carried the scent of blood and sweat through the air, weaving between broken glass and scattered debris. The night, once filled with the arrogance of Damian Vega and his men, now held only the weight of their defeat. Damian lay sprawled on the cold pavement, his face swollen, his pride shattered. His gang had fled. Even Elias Montenegro had walked away, recognizing the futility of this fight. But Valeria Cruz knew it wasn't over yet, not with Damian still breathing. She took a slow step forward, her boots crunching against the gravel. The dim light of a nearby street lamp flickered, casting long shadows along the alley walls. Damian coughed, shifting slightly. His fingers twitched as if trying to grab at something, anything to lift himself up, but there was nothing left for him now. Valeria crouched beside him, her movements deliberate, unhurried. She grabbed the collar of his jacket, jerking him up just enough for his bruised eyes to flutter open. Still breathing? She asked, voice calm. Damian let out a rough, pained chuckle. His lips split with the movement, blood trickling down his chin. Go to hell. Valeria smirked. You first. She let go. His head hit the pavement with a dull thud, and he groaned, weak, but still seething. His breath came in ragged bursts, the rise and fall of his chest erratic. She studied him, her gaze unwavering. You're not used to losing, are you? Damian spat blood onto the ground, his jaw tightening. You think this means anything? I'll come back, I'll rebuild, and when I do, you won't be around to stop me. Valeria sighed. You still don't get it. She straightened, rolling her shoulders as if this fight had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A glint of metal, a gun, lying just a few feet away, half hidden in the dirt. Damian saw it too. Everything happened in an instant. He lunged, but Valeria was faster. Before his fingers could reach the grip, she stomped down on his wrist, pinning it to the ground with brutal force. Damian let out a strangled yell, his body jerking from the shock of pain. He struggled, his free hand clawing at the pavement, but it was useless. Valeria crouched again, pressing her knee against his chest, crushing the last remnants of fight out of him. Still making bad choices, she murmured. Damian gasped, his pride finally crumbling into something else. Fear. Real, unfiltered, soul-crushing fear. Valeria had broken men before. She knew when the fight left their eyes, when the reality of true defeat sank in, and in that moment Damian Vega finally understood. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't someone he could intimidate, someone he could buy, someone he could outlast. She was the end of the road, and for the first time in his miserable life he realized he had lost. Valeria leaned closer, her voice a whisper. This is the last time we'll have this conversation, Vega. She pressed down harder on his wrist, making him whimper. You leave this town, tonight. You don't come back. Damian's breath hitched. He licked his split lips, his desperation barely concealed beneath his scowl. And if I do? She didn't blink. Then next time I don't let you get back up. The words cut deeper than any knife. Damian's chest rose and fell in quick, panicked breaths. He searched her face for weakness, for hesitation. There was none. For the first time, he knew she wasn't bluffing. She would do it. She would end him. And no one, not his gang, not his connections, not even Elias Montenegro would stop her. This was the end. Valeria slowly released him, standing tall. His hand twitched near the gun, but he didn't reach for it. Not this time. Instead, he swallowed hard and nodded. A silent agreement. A quiet surrender. Valeria exhaled. It was over. She stepped back, watching as Damian struggled to sit up, his entire body trembling from exhaustion, pain, and something far worse, humiliation. He wiped his bloodied mouth, glaring up at her one last time. But there was no power behind his stare anymore, no defiance, only the empty, hollow gaze of a man who had lost everything. She turned, walked away. The alley stretched before her, dark and endless, yet somehow lighter than before. Behind her, Damian stayed on the ground, unmoving. For the first time in his life, he had no words, no threats, no arrogance, just silence. And as Valeria disappeared into the night, he knew deep in his bones that he would never cross her path again, because she had done more than defeat him. She had erased him. The gunshot shattered the silence. Valeria moved on instinct, twisting just as the bullet missed her by inches. She darted behind cover, eyes scanning the rooftops. She wasn't alone. Another shot, closer. Then she saw him, Elias Montenegro. So he had changed his mind. Valeria sprinted, dodging bullets, reaching a fire escape. She climbed fast, her body burning, but she didn't stop. When she reached the rooftop, he was waiting. "Elias," she exhaled. He smirked. "You should have stayed down." They clashed, fast, brutal. Fists met flesh, dodging, countering, striking. They fought like equals, each move precise. But Elias had size, power. Valeria had speed, intelligence. Then, a mistake. His. She flipped him, pinning him, knife to his throat. A beat of silence. Then she pulled the blade away. Elias laughed. "You really are something." She stood, watching him smirk as he wiped blood from his lip. "You letting me go?" he asked. She shrugged. "Not my problem." He chuckled. "We'll see." Then, without another word, he disappeared into the night. Valeria exhaled. This wasn't over. Not even close. The bar had returned to its quiet rhythm. The shattered glass had been swept away, the tables set back in place. The bartender wiped down the counter with steady hands, though every so often his gaze drifted toward the door, half expecting her to return. But Valeria Cruz was gone. She had walked away from the fight without fanfare, without expectation. She didn't need thanks. Her work was done. Damian Vega was finished. His men had scattered, their once feared leader reduced to nothing more than a bruised memory. The town was free, for now. But whispers still filled the bar, drifting between clinking glasses and hushed conversations. "Did you see her move?" 6 men, just like that. She took down Montenegro. No one knew her name, but they would remember her. Outside, the night stretched endlessly before her. Valeria walked with steady steps, her wounds aching, but her mind already moving forward. Elias Montenegro was still out there. He had let her win. Or maybe she had let him live. Either way, she knew it wasn't over. Men like him didn't disappear, and somehow she didn't mind. A smirk tugged at her lips as she adjusted her leather jacket and pulled her green beret into place. This wasn't the end of her story. Somewhere another fight was waiting, and when it came, she'd be ready. A shadow lingered on a nearby rooftop, watching her disappear into the darkness. A quiet chuckle. "Elias," a voice murmured. "Looks like you found something interesting after all." The hunt was far from over.